We want to speak in this particular clip about the Mosaic covenant as a covenant of grace. It's important because there is this negativity to the Old Testament, toward the Mosaic covenant, that's grown up in the Christian world. And it's a very sharp and painful thing today to see people not understand the Hebrew Bible and to go off in a direction that really is not a good theology at all. And they no longer see the relevance of the Mosaic writings. And the Mosaic writings are foundational for all of our theology. So we left, in our last clip, we left you at the point of the Exodus, where God is rescuing our people from this terrible bondage in Egypt, and through no good works of their own, through nothing that they've done to earn it, Israel is now brought forth from the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. We won't go through the Passover events and the plagues and all of those things which are filled out in the book Jewish Roots, which again we advertise for you. But we just want to note that this was a supernatural salvation and rescue that was something like the world had never seen before and will never see again. The greatest miraculous act of history until we come to the resurrection of Yeshua and the outpouring of the Spirit on Pentecost, which is parallel to the Sinai events and intended to be parallel by God. Now, God brings the Jewish people to Mount Sinai and offers them a covenant. And the covenantal material from Exodus chapter 20 through until the book of Deuteronomy, all of that covenantal material there is connected to what we call gracious covenant material, or it's a covenant of grace. But especially we see this in Exodus chapter 20 and the book of Deuteronomy. In 1955, I believe it was, or significantly close to that, there was a scholar at the University of Michigan whose name was George Mendenhall, who was studying the Nuzi and Mari treaty tablets. These were archaeological finds from the Hittites, and found that the Hittite treaties between the Hittite king and his vassal kingdoms under him were extraordinarily parallel in form to the book of Deuteronomy especially, but had implications for how we understand the Ten Commandments. This was picked up by a scholar whose name is Meredith Kline at Gordon Conwell Divinity School in Treaty of the Great King, Samuel Schultz at Wheaton College, who wrote Deuteronomy, the Gospel of God's Love, and also the Gospel of Moses. And then it was picked up by Kenneth Kitchen at the University of Liverpool, and is still something that is argued today by Walter Kaiser, that the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace that affirms that God saved Israel through no good works of their own. It's not a covenant of works. It's not telling Israel that they need to earn their salvation. They already have God's salvation before they had done any good works. Nothing makes this more clear than Exodus chapter 20, which is usually understood to be the passage about the Ten Commandments, but the better title for this passage is the Covenant of the 10 Words, where God writes the commandments upon the tablets. But first, God spoke these words, and the covenant begins with these words: I am the Lord your God, Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's the holy name of God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. I brought you out of Egypt. Now, sadly, in many of the lists of the commandments, this first verse here in verse 2 is understood to be the first commandment and that you're supposed to be loyal to God, but it's not that. It's actually the preamble and the historical prologue together, which would fit the covenant treaties of the Hittites. So God historically brought us out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, but he affirms himself as the Lord our God. In other words, he has graciously saved us, and on the basis of the fact that he has saved us, he now gives us 10 stipulations of obedience that are the response of gratitude to the salvation that has been received. And we all know what's in the content of the 10 commandments. And then we recognize that one of the commandments in the middle is quite unique and seems to stand out in a different kind of way than the other commandments, which all seem to be very much moral commandments. And we read here in the middle of the covenant of 10 words that the children of Israel are to keep the Sabbath and that they are to rest, their children are to rest, their servants are to rest, their animals are to rest, because in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, and the seventh he rested. Why is this in the middle of the 10 commandments? And the answer to that is in Exodus chapter 31, where God says that the Sabbath is an oath, a sign between the children of Israel and himself. What we understand that there is a covenant sign, and the covenant sign in the Hittite treaties is the stamp of the image of their God that is stamped into the clay or carved into the tablet. And Israel cannot have any image of God. That's already forbidden in the second commandment. You'll, not make a graven image. And so instead of an image to bow down to or to receive, Israel receives a pattern of life of living by weeks, where for 6 days she will work, but the seventh day, after the pattern of God's own creation, she will rest on the seventh day, and the Sabbath is God's covenant sign between him and Israel. We find that the tablets are made in, there are 2 tablets, and the reason for the 2 tablets is also clear from the Hittite treaties. It's not because God wrote large and he couldn't write small enough to fit the commandments on one tablet, or there could have been a bigger tablet which would have included all 10. Rather, the reason for the 2 tablets is that the covenants of the Hittites and most nations at that time, when they were making a covenant between nations, between the ruling king and the subject nation, they were made in duplicate. And the reason they were made in duplicate is that one copy would go into the temple of the ruling nation, and the other copy would go into the temple of the subject nation. But in this case, Israel is the subject nation, but it's God's nation, so it's the ruling nation. So the 2 tablets are made to reflect that one of them is God's copy, and one of them is the copy for the people of Israel. And both copies are put into the tabernacle, later the temple, to show that both God and the people are committed absolutely to this covenant unity that they made as a covenant of grace. And they live out the stipulations of the covenant on the basis of God's forgiveness and grace, so that the motivation of obedience is gratitude. We then find, even more so in the book of Deuteronomy, but also throughout the Torah, that the Torah is an extraordinary covenant of grace. Just a word about the sacrificial system. The sacrificial system shows that Israel was not expected to live perfectly according to the standards of the Torah, but was expected to fall short. But as long as Israel's heart was toward God, and she was not sinning with a high hand of rebellion against God, she could live on the basis of the sacrifices being brought, both through the leadership and her own sacrifices. So on the basis of sacrificial blood, Israel was able to live in grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And that's an essential part of the covenant. All right, the book of Deuteronomy even more reflects the exact pattern of the Hittite treaty. And this is very important because the Hittite treaties were always put in the form of a covenant of grace. They began with a preamble, which was a short announcement of what the treaty was. Then they went through a historical prologue, which talked about the history of the relationship of the king and to the subject people. And then after the prologue, they would give the stipulations of the covenant, what was expected of the people in obedience to the gracious covenant which was offered, which they didn't deserve. And then after the stipulations, there's a section of blessings and cursings. These are the blessings that you will have if you will stay obedient to me, and these are the curses that you will have if you are disobedient. Then there are witnesses to the covenant. So in the case of Deuteronomy, you can't have anybody witness it in terms of human, because who's going to witness it for God? So heaven and earth witness. I call heaven and earth to witness. And then after that, you have instructions for depositing the covenant in the temple and for the succession of rulership. And all of that is in Deuteronomy in exact pattern and parallel to the Hittite treaty. I'm just going to take a little sip of water here while we continue. Now, the reason this is so important is because God affirms again and again in the book of Deuteronomy two things. One, that they were saved only by grace, not through their works. And secondly, he affirms Israel's call to be a witness to the nations by placing them on the land bridge of trade between the different continents. So in Deuteronomy chapter 9, we read these amazing words. In verse 4, do not say in your heart, it is because of my righteousness that Adonai has brought me into to possess the land. Verse 5, it is not by your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you're going to possess the land. Rather, it is the wickedness of these nations, and because Adonai is keeping the word he swore to your fathers. And then he says it is because of his mercy. And variously in these texts he will say it's because of his mercy and his love, not because of anything that Israel has done. In chapter 8, it's not because they are a large nation. It's not because they are powerful, but it's because of God's grace. In chapter 4, we read about Israel's call to be a witness to the nations and how God is making them distinct. And he says, I have taught you statutes and ordinance, verse 5, to do in the land, because it is wisdom and understanding in the sight of all the peoples who will hear these statutes and say, surely this is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has gods near to them as Adonai is whenever we call upon him? And what nation has statutes and ordinances that are righteous? We need to understand that the Mosaic covenant is Israel's constitution. And as a nation, every nation has to have a system of law and constitution that is its foundation for a civil order. So let's not compare the Mosaic covenant with the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13 as though this is kind of negative and not as loving because it's so full of laws and stipulations. No, these are gracious laws that will enable Israel to have a quality of life that is superior to all the nations around them. But again, we return to the fact of the pattern of the Hittite treaty, that this is totally a covenant of grace, placing Israel in the land so that she will be a witness to the reality of God to all of the nations around her.